Hi, I'm Evan MacDonald. I'm a precision agronomist with Croptomistic Technology, and today I'm going to talk about using SWAT maps in potato production. I won't dive too deep into the background behind SWAT maps in this presentation. We have a great video on our YouTube channel called Unlocking Your Soil Potential that was done by our VP of Agronomy, Wes Anderson, and that gives a great background into SWAT maps and how they're made and everything we use them for in kind of more general terms. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll just briefly touch on it. So SWAT stands for soil, water, and topography. And they're built from those stable factors in the field that don't really change over time or, take a really long time to change. So things like soil texture, soil organic matter, topsoil depth, salinity, how water moves across the field, where it sheds and where it collects, erosion, where erosion has occurred. So these long-term factors that aren't really changing from year to year, unlike something like satellite imagery or yield maps, which can be influenced by hundreds of different factors. SWAT maps are built from these stable factors that aren't really changing over time, and they help determine where we take soil samples from. So we measure the variability first, and then we soil sample. And then after that, we're using them for things like variable rate fertilizer, variable rate seeding, soil amendments, and more, which I'll touch on in this presentation and specific to potatoes. So when you look at a SWAT map, it's going to have 10 zones. And really the easiest way to think about it is in terms of water. So these zones 1 and 2 are kind of the high and dry hilltop areas, maybe have experienced some erosion over time, perhaps some more rocks at the surface there. As we get down the scale, more of the zones 9 and 10 are more the depression areas, so water collecting areas. They may cause problems if we have a wet spring or a wet fall. And in potatoes, they're likely the spots that are going to have road drainage problems. So we may need a grass waterway to drain certain areas, or they just may be areas that we manage a little bit differently, keeping in mind that there may be issues with too much moisture. So this image of a potato field here in Prince Edward Island early in the summer kind of shows some of those factors that we talked about on the last slide. So we see on the lower part of the picture kind of a zone 10 area, and that's a water collecting depression. So you can see road drainage issues there. The water is basically just sitting in between the rows, and it's really affecting the growth of that potato crop early in the season. And then as we kind of go up the slope a little bit, we have kind of more of a zone 7 or a mid kind of area of the field, a lower slope position that's generally fairly productive, but may not have the water logging issues of a zone 10. So it's getting a sufficient amount of moisture, and it's also draining very well. And then as we go up the slope to something like a zone 1, where we have a water shedding area, perhaps an area of the field that has experienced some erosion over time. If you think about it around here in the winter, if the field's been in bare soil, that's the part of the field where the snow is going to blow off of first. We're going to have, the wind and water erosion affecting those areas more than others, and a lot of times it's a shallower depth of topsoil there, more rocks at the surface, and generally lower yield potential in those zone 1, 2 kind of upper slope positions. So why would we consider SWAT maps for potatoes? Well, potatoes are an expensive crop to grow. We can see here in this example from Manitoba from 2018 where they calculated the cost of production for irrigated processing potatoes. And it comes out to about $3,800 an acre. So, that's fairly significant. And a lot of those inputs that go into that are things that we can influence with SWAT maps. So we can try and be more efficient and optimize our fertilizer applications, irrigation, variable rate planting, and even things like herbicides. I'll talk a little bit about some background research that's been done in precision agriculture and potato production. In 2014, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada did a study that used soil-based management zones from electrical conductivity data and soil texture and soil series information, and compared that to an intense grid sampling strategy for doing variable rate application of phosphorus and potassium. So the grid sampling strategy would be measuring the differences in soil nutrients and analysis from the lab, and the management zone strategy took into account the differences in soil texture and soil type. What they found was that the soil type in the management zone strategy had a greater impact on yield and more efficient applications of phosphorus and potassium. And they advised that soil-specific yield potential should be taken into account in precision agriculture by establishing realistic yield goals, and phosphorus and potassium recommendations should take soil texture groups into account. So we're not really getting that information if we do a grid sampling strategy. It's kind of ignoring those differences in soil texture and soil type. So those are factors that we're measuring with SWAT maps with our electrical conductivity information. Another study from Prince Edward Island in 2018 was looking at variability in potato yield here. And one of the main factors that they found that influenced our yield variability was soil texture. So it says here, under the rain-fed potato production on sandy loam soils and PEI, finer soil texture is likely related to increased yield through its effect on improved soil water holding capacity. So again, another study referencing the importance of understanding soil texture and soil variability within the field. And here was an older study done from the late 90s looking at potato yield and its relation to soil degradation in the early days of yield monitoring in potatoes. And what they found here, visual observations during harvest indicated substantial reductions in yield on the highly eroded sections of the field. Along with reduced yields, highly eroded areas appeared to have smaller tubers and a higher population of stones. So we can measure these areas with SWAT maps and identify those eroded knolls. And farms are doing a great job of limiting erosion now with things like cover crops and conservation tillage and soil conservation structures, but a lot of times it's hard to reverse the impacts of past erosion, and the option that we have now is to kind of manage those areas a little bit differently on the field and maybe manage our costs and manage our risk by measuring them and then addressing them with variable rate fertilizer, seed, irrigation, and more. So the background research is telling us that we should consider soil texture differences and landscape variability within the field. And we can do that with SWAT maps on a large scale. So what can we actually use SWAT maps for in potatoes? Well, fertilizer and soil amendments, so variable rate applications of things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, lime, manure, and more. Variable rate seeding, which I'll discuss. Things like variable rate soil applied herbicide, where maybe there's large soil texture differences in the field, and that will influence the efficacy of herbicide applications. And also things like variable rate irrigation, if we have capable irrigation systems that can do that. I'll just use an example here from a satellite image in July 2017 where this field was in potatoes. We can clearly see areas of the field that are a little bit weaker in terms of production and really showing up in the canopy of this crop from the summer of 2017, which was a very dry year. The satellite image though doesn't really give us an indication as to why those areas would be poorly performing. The SWAT map clearly indicates that those areas of the field that were poorly producing are kind of the zone 1 and 2 area hilltops with coarser textured, very sandy soil that over time has likely experienced a significant amount of erosion, and it's showing up in the production and the yield potential in the crop. So with those differences in mind, we can ask ourselves the question, should we fertilize that field with the same yield goal throughout the whole field? If we applied a grid sampling strategy, we may identify differences in soil chemistry, but we're still kind of ignoring those factors that are driving a lot of the yield variability there. The coarse textured sandy soils on the hilltops are kind of being ignored in a grid sampling strategy, and we're not able to properly address and manage those areas. So we're still soil sampling with SWAT maps. We just do it in a little different way. So we're pulling soil samples according to our zones. So we pull a few samples from the hilltops in red here, a few from the dark green depression areas that may have a little more moisture available, our mid-slope areas in yellow, our kind of generally more productive and stable yield zone areas in the light green color. So we can manage these differently when we fertilize, and we can come up with realistic yield goals for each area of the field based on those characteristics that we measured with SWAT maps. So which areas of the field are going to be the driest, which areas of the field are heavily eroded, and which areas of the field consistently yield well from year to year. We do that based on our soil analysis. So when we get our analysis back from the lab, we have samples that will give us an indication on the nutrient status levels in each of these different zones across the field. Outside of variable rate fertilizer application, we can look at things like variable rate planting. So a lot of the newer style potato planters have the ability to take in a file that will automatically adjust seed spacing rates according to pieces of information about the soil or about the field. So in this case, in Germany in 2017, they looked at adjusting plant spacing according to soil texture from electrical conductivity data, and they were quite successful and found that they could generate up to about $93 an acre more Canadian with variable rate seed spacing strategies. So we can use SWAT maps to influence variable rate planting strategy. So if you think of an eroded knoll on a field that generally has a lower yield potential than the rest of the field, and year to year it's just not producing, maybe we can space our seed out a little bit further there. And as we get down the slope into a well-drained lower slope position that from year to year yields pretty well, we can even look at tightening things up a little bit. So with this strategy, we can manage those different areas of the field that are either too wet or too dry or consistently yield well or consistently don't produce from year to year. Just an example here from a trial this season in Prince Edward Island in 2021 where we did different plant spacing strips across the field, and we're measuring how the crop responded in those different zones to those different plant spacings. So here on this zone 1 hilltop, we see where the grower standard spacing resulted in some more smalls and a little more inconsistent tuber size. And on the zone 1 area where we actually had a little bit wider spacing, it gave the crop a little bit more room to grow and resulted in a more consistent size profile there. So with this information, we have quite a few trials going on in this area this season and next, and we're going to hopefully generate some quality results to be able to influence our variable rate planting decisions going forward. Potatoes, of course, are a high value crop, and oftentimes they are an irrigated crop. So for growers who do irrigation, SWAT water may be appealing in that situation because it'll take into account the differences in soil moisture, not just from one location where a probe may be, but across the whole field. So when we have a soil moisture probe giving us information on the status of soil moisture in that location in the field, we can model that across the whole field by taking into account the differences in soil texture and topography there, but also in terms of rainfall, and we get that from local weather stations. So it can really be a solution used for variable rate irrigation or something like variable rate top dressing at certain times of year if we want to apply a little additional something like nitrogen to places in the field that are going to be more likely to take advantage of it. So here is an actual variable rate irrigation file created by a partner of ours down in Texas, Jeff Miller with Forefront Agronomy. On this pivot, you'll see that he is actually applying more water on these zone 1, 2 upper landscape areas and applying less down in the lower landscape positions. That would an area of the field that's going to have more moisture available. So what you see on the prescription file here is the pivot is slowing down, going over these upper landscape areas, and then it's speeding up, going over the areas that are showing up as green on the SWAT map. So the idea here is to apply the right amount of water according to those differences in soil moisture across the field. We don't want to be over applying water in areas that may already have enough moisture, because that can cause as many problems as having not enough water in certain areas. So with SWAT maps and with SWAT water in particular, we're able to make these accurate variable rate irrigation prescriptions. And this is going to be something that's monitored more closely through regulations in the future. Water resources are scarce in a lot of places, and we need to be mindful of putting the right amount of water on according to the soil moisture status in the field. And we know that just where we have a soil moisture sensor isn't enough. That's just one point on that whole field that isn't going to accurately represent the moisture status across the field. So by using SWAT maps and a moisture sensor, we're able to make a more accurate prescription. Here you can see an example of SWATCAM, which is basically a low-cost camera solution that was mounted to a spray boom, so one on each side of a sprayer. And when that camera is powered up, it's taking pictures across the field about every 40 feet or so. And when it's done, we can see where the images were taken on a SWAT map, and we can start to inspect and see what crop cover was like in those areas. Perhaps it's an emergence assessment tool. But in the future, with a crop like potatoes, it can be used as a scouting tool as well. So as we get into using machine learning and artificial intelligence, we'll be able to train these images to look for, or train algorithms to look for certain issues in images, whether that be nutrient deficiencies or pests or whatever it may be. And SWATCAM has the potential to be a bit of a scouting tool in potatoes and assist in our crop scouting, and perhaps make those scouting trips a little bit more efficient when we know which areas might need a little bit more of attention before we head into the field. Thank you for checking out this presentation on using SWAT maps in potato production. As time goes on and as we get into the future and the equipment keeps getting better and more able to address the variability at a finer scale, this technology will just become more and more important. So you can reach us on our website, through Twitter or email. You see those addresses there. Thank you very much again, and have a great day.